Step into the elegant dining room of the President's Mansion in Washington, D.C. It's 1814. A lavish feast is laid out on a long mahogany table. Crystal glasses, glint silver platters wait, and the smell of roast meat and warm bread fills the air. Wine is poured, but the U.S. President is gone. The entire government has vanished. Suddenly, heavy wooden doors crash open. Not politicians for dinner, but dirty armed British soldiers, grinning with amusement. They sit in the president's chair, eat his warm meal, and drink his expensive wine. They toast his health with mockery. Then, full and satisfied, they pile the wooden furniture in the center of the room, grab torches, and set the mansion on fire. This is the only time in American history a foreign enemy invaded and occupied the nation's capital. This is the War of 1812, a forgotten, humiliating, absurd conflict of British arrogance, American military collapse, a First Lady's legendary bravery, and the supernatural storm that saved a city from total ruin. To understand why British soldiers ate the president's dinner, go back to the years after the Louisiana Purchase. America was expanding west, fast brimming with confidence and ambition. But across the Atlantic, Europe was torn apart by a brutal fight for survival. Britain versus Napoleon, Bonaparte, and the French Empire. Britain needed the world's most powerful navy to beat Napoleon, and a massive navy needed thousands of skilled sailors. Life on British warships was a nightmare: rotten food, brutal floggings for small mistakes, and almost no pay. Tens of thousands of British sailors deserted to American merchant ships, where wages were higher and captains kinder. Britain was furious. They declared a harsh policy: once a Briton, always a Briton. They refused to recognize American citizenship. So the Royal Navy did something outrageously arrogant and aggressive. They intercepted American merchant ships in the middle of the Atlantic. Armed British officers boarded the ships, lined up the crew, and searched them at gunpoint. If an officer decided a man looked or sounded British, he was kidnapped on the spot and forced to serve in the Royal Navy. This cruel practice was called impressment. From 1803 to 1812, the British Navy kidnapped over 6,000 American sailors. They tore men from their families and forced them to fight in a foreign war. It was a massive, unforgivable insult to American sovereignty. America was an independent nation, but Britain still treated it like a rebellious, pitiful colony. And the kidnappings at sea were only half the problem. As American pioneers pushed west into the newly acquired land, they faced fierce resistance from Native American tribes. A brilliant, charismatic Shoshone leader, Tecumseh, was building a huge united Native alliance to stop American expansion. The U.S. soon learned a terrifying truth. Native warriors were shooting at them with brand new advanced British muskets. Britain's empire in Canada was actively funding and arming Native tribes, making Americans bleed to halt their westward march. Anger in Washington, D.C. boiled over. A group of aggressive young politicians from the South and West, called the Warhawks, screamed for revenge. They demanded America declare war on Britain, invade Canada, and drive the British off the continent forever. The U.S. president then was James Madison, a brilliant, quiet intellectual, the main architect of the Constitution. But he was no military commander. Madison knew America was utterly unprepared for war. The federal government was nearly bankrupt. The U.S. Army had fewer than 7,000 untrained soldiers. The U.S. Navy had only about a dozen warships. They were about to fight a superpower with over 600 fully armed ships. It was a mouse challenging a lion. The pressure was too great, even with the odds stacked against them. On June 18, 1812, America officially declared war on the British Empire. The first 2 years of the war were a total unmitigated disaster for the U.S. The grand plan to invade Canada failed spectacularly. American generals were old, incompetent, and completely disorganized. In one deeply humiliating moment, the U.S. commander at Detroit surrendered his entire army and fort without firing a single shot, terrified by the deafening war cries of native warriors outside the walls. But the real nightmare came in 1814. In Europe, Britain and its allies finally defeated Napoleon. The European War was over. Britain no longer had to split its focus. It could turn the full terrifying power of its seasoned, battle-hardened military machine straight at America. They sent thousands of elite veterans across the Atlantic. In August 1814, a massive British fleet, led by Admiral George Cockburn, sailed into the Chesapeake Bay. They landed a highly disciplined raiding party of over 4,000 soldiers in Maryland, just days from Washington, D.C. The U.S. government fell into total panic. President Madison scrambled to organize a defense. He barely gathered 6,000 men, mostly untrained, terrified local militia. They met the advancing British at a place called Bladensburg in Maryland. The Battle of Bladensburg was the nation's ultimate humiliation. As soon as the British fired their new, screaming Congreve rockets at the U.S. lines, the colonial militia broke and ran. They dropped their weapons and fled in pure terror. The retreat was so fast and chaotic that historians mockingly named it the Bladensburg Races. The road to the capital was now wide open. Inside the president's mansion, chaos reigned. President Madison had ridden out to watch the battle, and now he was fleeing for his life, galloping into the Virginia forests. But his wife, First Lady, Dolley Madison, refused to leave until the very last possible second. Dolley Madison was a beloved, highly respected figure. As she heard the roar of British cannons growing closer to the city, she looked around the elegant rooms. She knew she couldn't save the heavy furniture. But she saw something absolutely priceless to the nation's soul. An 8-foot-tall, full-length portrait of George Washington by Gilbert Stuart. She knew if the British captured the painting, they would parade it through the streets of London as a devastatingly humiliating trophy. Dolley ordered her enslaved servants and remaining staff to save the portrait. The painting was bolted firmly to the wall, and they couldn't unscrew the bolts in time. They smashed the heavy wooden frame, carefully removed the canvas, rolled it tight, and handed it to two men who fled in a carriage. Only when the portrait was safe did Dolley Madison jump into her carriage and escape into the darkening hills. A few hours later, British troops marched into the empty, silent capital. British General Robert Ross was a highly disciplined officer. He strictly ordered his men not to burn private homes. They were there to make a political statement, destroy the symbols of the American Republic. British soldiers marched to the U.S. Capitol, home to the Senate House of Representatives and the Library of Congress. They piled chairs, tables, and thousands of precious, irreplaceable books together. They poured gunpowder over the pile and struck a match. The massive building erupted in a terrifying fire. The heat was so intense that thick glass lamps shattered and stone columns cracked open. Next, they marched down Pennsylvania Avenue to the president's mansion. They ate Madison's dinner, drank his wine, and set the mansion ablaze. Flames leaped high into the night sky. The fire was so bright that residents in Baltimore, 40 miles away, could see the red glow in the clouds clearly. By the next morning, America's proud, newly built capital was a smoking black ruin. British soldiers wandered the streets, confident, planning to continue their destruction. But suddenly, the sky turned pitch black. On August the 25th, 1814, a rare, violently fierce weather event slammed into the burning city. A massive, destructive hurricane hit Washington, D.C. Winds were so strong they tore the roofs off houses, and within the terrible storm, a huge tornado touched down. It landed directly in the heart of the city, a scene of apocalypse. The funnel cloud lifted heavy British cannons clean off the ground and tossed them through the air like toys. It uprooted trees. Several British soldiers were killed instantly by flying debris and collapsing brick walls. But the most important thing the storm did was unleash a torrential downpour. Rain fell hard for 2 straight hours, dousing the raging fires the British had set. The British commanders were deeply unnerved. They had survived French cannons and American muskets, but now it felt like God himself was attacking them. Their ships, anchored in the harbor, were badly damaged by the storm. Fearing their escape route would be cut off, the British troops quickly gathered their gear, abandoned the ruined city, and marched back to their ships. Washington, D.C. was saved from total destruction by a random, miraculous act of nature. But the war was far from over. The British fleet did not sail home. They simply turned to a bigger, wealthier target. They steered their massive warships north, straight for the bustling port city of Baltimore. To capture Baltimore, they had to sail past Fort McHenry, a heavily fortified, star-shaped brick fortress. As the British launched a terrifying non-stop, 25-hour bombardment of the fort, an American lawyer was trapped on a nearby ship, watching the explosions in the dark. He was searching for a specific flag in the smoke. His name was Francis Scott Key, and the lyrics he was about to write would become the nation's ultimate anthem. And in the swamps of the far south, a ruthless, aggressive militia general named Andrew Jackson waited for the British with a wall of cotton and a line of loaded rifles. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel.